Hey everybody, it's Tom Woods. I want to address the Mother Jones article called Ron Paul's 15 Most Extreme Positions. We all know what extreme means in this context. Of course, it means he disagrees with both Hillary Clinton and Mitt Romney. So he's obviously an enemy of society who must be stopped. Now, I like to keep these videos brief, so I'm going to go through all 15 of these very quickly, and then at the end I'll refer you to a resource page where you can find articles and videos that will elaborate in greater detail on the points that I'm making here. So, the first one is Eviscerate Entitlements. Ron Paul believes that Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid are unconstitutional. Well, that's quite a defensible position constitutionally, but is his position that he wants to eviscerate these programs? Well, as he's made clear, his first priority is to reduce the U.S. government's overseas spending on all the military bases and the large imperial presence that is completely at odds with American tradition and conservatism and everything else, good sense and so on and so forth, and that he would take the money and use that to ease the transition away from these programs. And yes, he is disagreeing with Clinton and Romney on this issue on the grounds that the unfunded liabilities for these programs are greater than twice the GDP of the whole world. That's a teensy-weensy problem. And his view is that, young people are people too. And they're going to be putting in money year after year after year for programs that are obviously going to collapse, that can't possibly pay out for them. And he wants to give them a chance to get out of this impossible situation and to provide for their own retirement, give them extra money, leave them with extra money to provide for their own retirement. And he does not believe that before 1937, people just left their elderly parents to die in the gutter. We have no newspaper headlines indicating that people were stepping over corpses on their way to work. And we might also ask, what is leading to these high healthcare prices in the first place that leads us to think that if it weren't for Medicare, everyone would be dead and so on and so forth? Where did these high prices come from? Is that the free market leading to these high prices? Well, that's an answer that you'll get when we get to my resource page at the end. Lay off half his cabinet. He wants to abolish half the cabinet departments. Only half? So he wants to get rid of the departments of energy, education, agriculture, commerce, health and human services, homeland security, and labor. Well, again, I want to keep these brief, but Department of Commerce, well, this is a lot of corporate welfare subsidies. I mean, why is it so unthinkable that we could get rid of that? Or the Department of Education. But here's something that when it was established during Jimmy Carter's tenure, the American Federation of Teachers was against it because they thought one more layer of bureaucracy was not the solution to our educational problems. The New York Times editorialized against it. The Washington Post editorialized against it. So here's something that years ago the establishment itself thought was probably a bad idea. But in 2011, such is our free society, if you utter so much as a peep against it, well, you're an enemy of society, you're an extremist. Ooh, unbelievable how the range of opinion, allowable opinion, has shrunk since Jimmy Carter's day. Everybody was allowed to be against it then. Or the Department of Homeland Security. Ann Applebaum is a historian who wrote for Foreign Policy magazine earlier in 2011. Foreign Policy magazine is extremely mainstream magazine. No extremism in there. And Ann Applebaum said that the Department of Homeland Security serves one purpose, and that is to provide unimaginable bonanzas for favored congressional districts around the United States, most of which face no statistically significant terrorist threat whatsoever. In fact, if you look at the number of companies that had Homeland Security contracts with the government, in 1999 it was 7 companies. In 2003, it was about 3,500 companies. By 2006, it was nearly 34,000 companies. They've got their own trade shows and lobbyists, but this is all just to protect you and me, you understand. It's so quaint the way this, what's his name? Josh Harkinson, who wrote this article, he just believes what the government tells him, He's been taught that since he was in government schools, He's been taught just believe what the authorities tell you. And they tell me, well, the department, it's called Homeland Security, right? So it's just looking out for me. Who would possibly question the gravy train that this thing has made possible? I love his quaint confidence in the authorities, right? Don't question authority, citizen. Trust your overlords. Okay, next one. Ron Paul would enable state extremism. Let me read this one to you. Would let states set their own policies on abortion, gay marriage, prayer in school, and most other issues. Oh my gosh. The earth is going to tumble from its axis and go heading toward the sun. Unbelievable. We can't have that. Now notice the way he frames this whole thing. This would be state extremism. So there's that word again, right? Extremism. Ooh, be careful. Well, let's note that he doesn't refer to the TSA's hands in your pants as federal extremism, or the Patriot Act as federal extremism, or incarcerating the Japanese during the 1940s as federal extremism. There is no extremism at the federal level, citizen. It's only when we let you stupid rubes make your own decisions and govern yourselves. Now, of course, the whole point of the American Revolution was local self-government. And, of course, constitutionally, this is obviously the correct position. Nobody in the state ratifying conventions for a second would have thought that these were federal issues. Absolutely zero, nobody at all. But that is Ron Paul's view, that yes, people ought to have some kind of say in how they are governed. Meanwhile, Josh Harkinson is a left-wing nationalist. All questions have a national answer, citizen. Don't tell me that we can have differences of opinion in this country. We're going to have one opinion, we're going to shove it down your throats. Well, that's sweet. So much for small is beautiful. Okay, number 4, protect sexual predators' privacy. This is because he voted against the so-called SAFE Act, which is about securing kids from the possibility of child pornography. Well, again, Josh Harkinson's view is, well, if the act is called the SAFE Act, then it must be about keeping kids safe, right? That's all I need to know is the name of the act. So therefore, if Congressman Paul was against it, he obviously favors child pornography. I mean, what other conclusion could we draw? Here's this square guy who's never even seen a marijuana joint, who's been married to the same woman for over 50 years, has a whole bunch of kids and grandkids, but he's it's just incredible the way the thought controllers in this country operate. Well, his objection to this act was that the wording is extremely broad, such that the innocent were not adequately protected. And as I'll show on my resource page, he has taken steps against online predators when he thought those steps were constitutionally authorized. Number 5, rescind the bin Laden raid. Instead of authorizing the Navy SEALs to take him out, President Paul would have sought Pakistan's cooperation to arrest him. Oh, well, there's extremism right there. Well, first of all, before we even go into the details of this, think about this. 99% of the country is just pumping their fists in the air, USA, USA, with the capture of bin Laden. So here's a guy who comes along and says, now wait a minute, obviously we're all happy about the capture of bin Laden. Ron Paul would have brought it about years earlier because he wouldn't have been distracted by the ridiculous neocon mission to nowhere in Iraq, and he would have used the letters of marque and reprisal to pinpoint bin Laden. So he would have had him wouldn't have spent trillions of dollars over 10 years to catch one old man, for heaven's sake. But more specifically here, just from the start, just think about the fact that you got 99% of the country thrilled about this, not thinking about any of the details, and yet Ron Paul says, now wait a minute, hold on a minute, people. There are some considerations here that are being left out of the discussion, and I want to insert them into the discussion. I mean, here's a guy who obviously, he's smart enough to know he could have gotten along a lot more easily if he had just gone along with the conventional wisdom, shut his mouth, and let that be that. But yet, at this moment, he nevertheless says, now wait a minute, I have some concerns about this. Regardless of your position on Ron Paul or this issue, you have to respect this. Somebody who will tell the whole country, I think you're missing something. Think about people who are very much opposed to Ron Paul. Think about their candidates. When have their candidates ever in their entire lives, from the moment they were running for class president up to now, when have they ever taken a position like that? Well, of course, never. And basically, Ron Paul's position is simply that why unnecessarily alienate Pakistan, which is a country you need their help in the so-called war on terror. Why would you unnecessarily antagonize them? And his view is that, look, obviously if bin Laden were holed up in England, we wouldn't just go in there and grab him. Obviously there would be a cooperative effort with England. And he's just suggesting that perhaps this imperial arrogance that says, well, we're the USA, we can act however we want, And who the heck cares? Pakistan is one of what Mo Sizlak on The Simpsons called one of these loser countries, so we don't need to treat them with respect. Maybe there might be other ways of acting in the world. That's all. Just thinking. Sorry for being so extreme. Number 6, you'll never believe this one. Simplify the census. Oh man, throw this guy in jail. Simplify the census. My gosh, what an extremist. And this is the summary of Ron Paul's view. The questions posed by the Census Bureau's annual American Community Survey are, quote, both ludicrous and insulting, Paul says. Well, I'll deal with this one on my resource page. But basically, constitutionally, they can ask you, your name and how many people are in your household. That's about it, and that's his view. That's all he's saying. He's just repeating what the Constitution says. That makes you an extremist. Number 7, let the oldest profession be. And the summary here is, Paul wants to legalize prostitution at the federal level. Well, not quite. It's not that he wants to legalize it. His argument is the federal government has no authority over it in the first place. Has no authority over it in the first place. This obviously is a state issue. And constitutionally, who could deny that? And here we have the guy who, of all congressmen in Washington, is the guy least likely to use a prostitute. And he's the one being smeared as being pro-prostitution. Now, his view is the federal government has no role in it. And they don't call it the world's oldest profession for nothing. It has a way of perpetuating itself, and the way most societies have dealt with it is not by fruitlessly trying to stamp it out everywhere, but more or less through social norms. It winds up being confined to the bad part of town, and so on and so forth. Even St. Thomas Aquinas said that prostitution could be legally tolerated, and he was not a hippie. Number 8, legalize all drugs. Oh, again, unthinkable, because our overlords have told us, Hillary Clinton and Mitt Romney have told us, nothing to see here, people, this is the most super policy in the history of mankind. Regardless of how failed and futile it is, I did a video on this that I'll refer you to again on my resource page, but here again, Ron Paul's position is that this is not a federal issue. Now, when Prohibition came along, they had to amend the Constitution to prohibit alcohol, and yet suddenly you can prohibit all these drugs just through a legislative act? So his view is no, this is up to the states, and maybe some states will come up with a more humane solution to this problem than just cracking some skulls and throwing people into cages. Number 9, keep monopolies intact, because Ron Paul opposes federal antitrust legislation, calling it, quote, much more harmful than helpful. So again, no attempt to refute Ron Paul, because again, our friend Josh Harkinson, he's kind of forgettable. I keep having to look up his name. But Harkinson's view is that, well, it's supposed to be opposed to monopoly, right? That's what antitrust legislation says it's about. So I'll just believe that that must be what it's about. Now, how many books on antitrust law do you think Josh Harkinson has read, right? I mean, my guess is you take all the books on antitrust that have ever been written, you roll them into a ball, you get rid of them, and what remains is pretty much what he's read on this subject. So again, on my resource page, I'm going to refer you to some stuff on this. I've written about this in my Politically Incorrect Guide to American History. But basically, the exact opposite of what you've been taught about antitrust is correct. And you're not going to hear many economists who make very good livings serving as consultants and expert witnesses in antitrust cases speaking out against the conventional wisdom. But it's based on a theory of monopoly that is unfounded. And empirically, the way antitrust has been used is utterly irrational, has done untold damage to the economy, and has consistently harmed consumers from the get-go. It was never designed to help consumers. It was always a scam from the start. And when you read the real history of antitrust, you will not believe it. But Josh Harkinson won't. All he knows is antitrust protects us from monopolies. So if you're against this, you must favor monopolies. Good grief. Number 10, lay off Ben Bernanke. Now, he means lay off like, fire him. Because Ron Paul would abolish the Federal Reserve and revert to the use of currencies that are backed by hard assets such as gold. Well, this is a big issue, the Federal Reserve, but the implication here is it's extreme to be against the Federal Reserve, because don't you know what a wonderful institution it is and the wonderful stability it's given us? Sure, the Great Depression occurred under the Fed's watch, and the horrific ordeal we're enduring now occurred under the Fed's watch, but, you got to overlook, they're going to have some problems. Well, in fact, real statistics, not the phony baloney ones that were used 20 years ago, but up-to-date statistics show that the economy actually has not been more stable, has not had fewer and shallower recessions in the age of the Fed, and meanwhile the Fed has debased the dollar to about 4% of its earlier value. Ron Paul's position is competition. Why give the dollar artificial advantages? If you want to keep using it, go ahead. But take the artificial disadvantages off gold and silver if people want to transact in those. I mean, isn't this a free country? What is the big deal about that? Number 11, stop policing the environment. Now, here's the description here. Ron Paul believes that climate change is no big deal, and the Environmental Protection Agency is unnecessary. Most environmental problems, in his view, can be addressed by enforcing private property rights. Okay, but didn't you just say he favors stop policing the environment? But then you say environmental problems can be addressed by enforcing private property rights. Wasn't that kind of a contradiction? He's obviously not going to stop policing the environment, but his view is that there's a different way of going about it, a more effective way, a more just way, a more environmentally sound way, and that is through private property rights. In the 19th century, that was the method that was used. Up until, well, maybe the mid-19th century, the courts suddenly decided to abandon that approach of finding who the polluter was and punishing him. No, instead, the thought was, well, look, hey, we need some pollution for progress, so we're just going to regulate it. Well, you can get away with some pollution, we'll just regulate it. And so forget about if you have some kind of nuisance complaint or, there's some pollution, on your property. Hey, look, it's just the price you have to pay for progress. Well, Ron Paul's view is that, well, that's not just at all. If there's a property violation, it ought to be addressed. So I will, again, refer you to information on that, and you'll find that it's an entirely sensible position, and it makes perfect sense from the point of view of private property, people's individual rights, and the environment. So he's not going to stop police. It's just, again, totally misleading. Number 12 deals with the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This is a big issue and very hard to deal with in a short video. But very quickly, the employment aspect. And again, here's a position Ron Paul, the easiest thing in the world would be to say, yep, this was the greatest piece of legislation in the history of mankind, now leave me alone. Okay, and he knows he's going to be accused of having sinister motives, and he's a bad guy, and be smeared all the time if he takes this on, and he does it anyway. Again, this is not, this isn't something, Rudy Giuliani isn't going to do that. He'll give you all the predictable, I can script everything that's going to come out of that guy's mouth. Does that make him a hero? No, basically there are 2 points to this. The employment aspect of it basically is as follows. That, again, we're taught that nobody would make any progress if it weren't for federal regulation. If it weren't for the federal government, we'd all be dead in a ditch. We'd all be eating poisoned food. We'd all be earning $1 a day. Our kids would all be in mines. I'm trying to refute that in my writing and in my articles and so forth. But on the employment angle, we're taught that, if it weren't for the Civil Rights Act of 1964, there'd be no black middle class, there'd be no black employment, and so on and on. But this is just phony baloney nonsense that you can verify just by looking at the statistics. From 1954 to 1964, the 10 years before the Civil Rights Act, the number of blacks in professional and technical occupations more than doubled. In other kinds of occupations, blacks saw even greater progress in the 1940s, when there was hardly any civil rights policy to speak of, than in the 1950s, when the civil rights movement was in its heyday. The rise in the number of blacks in professional and technical occupations in the 2 years following the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was less than in the 1 year from 1961 to 1962. And when we look at percentages, we see again that there is no acceleration by the Civil Rights Act of 1964 of employment trends that were already in existence. So the percentage of employed blacks who were managers and administrators was the same in 1967 as it was in 1964 and 1960. Thomas Sowell has a lot of this information, and again, on my resource page, I'll include it. Mexican-American incomes rose in relation to those of whites from 1959 to 1969, it's true, but not at a greater rate than they had from 1949 to 1959, before the Civil Rights Act. Chinese and Japanese American households had matched their white counterparts in income already by 1959. So again, the conventional wisdom on this, which is based on nothing, is completely phony. Then in terms of segregation, well, this is tougher because it's very hard not to sympathize with people who were subject to all kinds of indignities that very few human beings today would defend. But obviously in the year 2011, if somebody is going to have a racially restrictive restaurant, well, he's going to be boycotted and picketed out of existence in about 5 seconds. And in fact, when you think of places that would survive with a policy like that, these would be backwater institutions run by yahoos. I mean, like, do you really want to be associated with an institution like that, a restaurant or whatever facility like that? I mean, wouldn't it be better to know who these people are so that you can withhold your dollars from them? Now, Ron Paul's view is that private property is private property. He's a Lockean Rothbardian in the philosophy of private property, and his view is that property is acquired in certain ways, justly, and that once somebody acquires it, there is no third party that magically acquires authority over your property just because you happen to open it to the public. It's still your property, and you can act like a jerk if you want to on your property. But it's extremely dangerous to curtail private property rights, even when it seems like the just thing to do. Inserting violence into the equation is not the just thing to do. And in particular, given that attitudes on race were liberalizing dramatically in the 50s and 60s, well, again, we already see that tremendous progress was being made. And then with the Voting Rights Act of 1965, that really did away with a great many of the problems, particularly in school desegregation. It wasn't the court cases that did away with that. It was granting voting rights. And then suddenly, amazingly, the politicians cared about this previously despised minority. Number 13, let markets care for the disabled. The Americans with Disabilities Act, says Ron Paul, should never have been passed. The treatment of the handicapped should be left to the free market. And this is supposed to be extremism. Okay, well, let's go through that. After the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed, the employment of Americans with disabilities plummeted. Well, now, why should that be? I mean, Josh Harkinson would say, well, it's called the Americans with Disabilities Act. So it obviously helps people with disabilities. I mean, didn't you read the name of the act? Okay, well, you look at it, though, and it didn't do that. Well, why didn't it? Well, before the act, if you wanted to hire somebody with a disability, well, you would try it out and see if the person's productivity outweighed the special accommodations you'd have to make for that person's disability. And if it worked out, great. If it didn't, then you try something else. But after the act, well, then you have to submit to what the government decides is a fair wage and a fair amount to pay for accommodation. And if it doesn't work out, then you're slapped with a lawsuit. So what people decided to do at that point was, well, I'm just not going to hire them in the first place. And you say, aha, well, then we can sue them for employment discrimination. But if they're clever enough about the way they market the job, the disabled will never find out about the job in the first place. So why do any disabled support this legislation? Well, if you were employed before the legislation went into effect, then you're doing great, because now you're in there and you've got a lawsuit-protected job. Like, you're not going anywhere. But now it's a barrier to entry for other people with disabilities. So this is not a point of view you're going to read in Mother Jones, because we're just going to confine ourselves to the name of the act, Americans with Disabilities Act. What, do you hate people with disabilities? You want to push them down the stairs or something? This is the level of conversation they want us to have. Number 14, we're almost done, is called First Do Harm. He wants to end birthright citizenship. Oh my goodness gracious. Again, the earth is going to tumble into the sun. Well, only 30 out of the world's 194 countries have birthright citizenship. And among the advanced economies, only Canada and the United States have automatic birthright citizenship for the children of illegal aliens. So I will anxiously await the massive global campaign against this, led by Mother Jones magazine. Basically, just Ron Paul's view is that this puts a burden on the American welfare state, and moreover, there's a certain absurdity to the position. My friend Kevin Gutzman points this out. Let's suppose Canada a Canadian army invaded the U.S., and one of the women in the army, while she was invading the U.S., gave birth. That means that the child of a member of an invading army automatically becomes a U.S. citizen, and seems and can collect like food stamps or something. Does it seem a little bit peculiar? So that's simply his position. It's a position that's held by most of the countries of the world. The immigration policies of Mexico are far more stringent than those of the U.S. And again, we'll await the great campaign against that, led by Mother Jones magazine. And finally, number 15, diss Mother Teresa. Because he voted against giving her the Congressional Gold Medal. He also voted against giving a similar medal to Ronald Reagan. And they mock him by saying he argued that the medal, which cost $30,000, is too expensive. Well, what he actually said was not that it was too expensive, but that it's very easy to spend other people's money. It seems $30,000. Well, they burn through that in a fraction of a second, so why should they think twice about this? But his argument was, we're pretty wealthy here in Congress. If every congressman put up $100, we would more than cover the price of this metal. So, put your money where your mouth is. You want to honor this person? Honor her with your own money. You want to honor this former president? Honor him with your own money. $100. I mean, these people spend that on a bottle of wine. Lead by example. And Ron Paul was willing to put that $100 forth. Not one other congressman was willing to do it. And we're told we're supposed to despise him and love all these other establishment hacks? I suggest the truth is the other way around. Okay, I went as fast as I could through the 15 extreme positions. Ooh. But I'm going to put up a resource page, so once you see this video, it'll be up, and you'll find it at tomwoods.com/Mother Jones, where you'll find some resources that will elaborate on some of the points I made here. But if you're going to try and make something stick to Ron Paul, you have to try a little bit harder than this. He disagrees with Hillary Clinton and Mitt Romney. To jail with this enemy of the people. Good grief. Heaven help us. Thanks for listening.